This is In the Loop, and I'm Cody LaGrow in for Christian Bryant. In recent weeks, there have been efforts to outlaw what's known as caste discrimination in the U.S. Seattle, Washington became the first city to ban it back in February, and now California may add caste as a protected category to its state law, becoming the first state to make discrimination based on caste explicitly illegal. Before we get to how it's impacting things here, we thought we would give you a little history on where exactly this came from.
Well, the caste system itself is very complex.
To understand it, we spoke with Purnima Tivan, an associate professor of history at the University of Washington, who specializes in the social and cultural history of early modern South Asia.
The simplest way to explain it is that it is an inherited system of privilege that is based on prescriptions laid down by the group that at the very top end of this particular hierarchical system.
The main concept comes from an ancient Indian religious text called the Rig Veda, which says the origin of all life began with a supreme being. From there, others were born into four categories, referred to as varnas, which came from different parts of this supreme being's body, starting with the head. I'll let Tivan explain.
At the very top end of this particular hierarchical system, Brahmins, who were traditionally educators, priests, ritual specialists. The next step up are Kshatriyas, who were traditionally belonging to this warrior soldiers. Often kings and rulers or village chiefs would come from that particular strata. And then another step down this imagined hierarchical system are Vaishyas, merchants, traders, people who are engaged in trade. And then the next down are peasants, people who do manual labor. These were called Shudras in the Sanskrit texts. And then beyond these are groups that are considered to have occupations that are considered ritually polluting by the upper castes, the top three in the hierarchy, and therefore social interactions with them were often prescribed.
Now, I know this can sound a little confusing, so we also spoke to Associate Professor of History at Georgetown University, Ananya Chakravarti, to better understand how people are divided by caste.
The idea is that, the system itself depends on sort of separation between jatis, but it is fundamentally a hierarchical system. So it's a form of social hierarchy, which has elements of, in the past especially, of heredity specialization, but fundamentally the thing that holds it together is the practice of endogamy.
Caste is an oppressive system, just like racism, but it's important not to conflate the two. While a person's race can be visually obvious, casteism relies on complex signifiers like family occupation, last name, location of residence, and even dietary habits. The so-called upper castes historically got the better jobs and were usually vegetarian, which was considered a ritually pure diet. So-called lower castes were relegated to menial and often dehumanizing labor. They were poor and often ate a diet of readily available meat. That's why they were often thought of as impure. These Shudras, often called Dalits, were discriminated against and treated as untouchables. So how is this discrimination system impacting things today? Latest estimates suggest about 25% of India's 1.3 billion population are grouped under the country's legal category known as scheduled caste. That includes the Dalit community. There's also a scheduled tribe group. These are India's indigenous tribes. Both these groups have faced the brunt of caste discrimination.
Once you're born into that particular caste, you are never going to leave it. It is not possible to actually change your caste status no matter how much education you have or if your income levels change. So the discrimination that is part of this system has existed for many centuries.
The caste system evolved over millennia as the Indian subcontinent was led by different rulers. It was officially outlawed in 1948, a year after India's independence from Britain. But experts familiar with South Asia say the practice is still alive in parts of the country.
In 2023, we still have people who, from these supposedly low castes, who are sent down in India to do manual scavenging and, literally go down sewer holes and things. So that's an example of the continued kind of occupational specialization that still operates and is somehow sort of legitimized by recourse to this ideology.
We have ample evidence from social scientists and political theorists who have studied the system that discrimination, while less, is still ongoing and of a serious enough nature that the government has continued to retain several protective legal categories that protect not just the scheduled castes and tribes, but also other groups considered other backward castes.
Now, we wanted to understand the kinds of discrimination the so-called lower castes face in the U.S. Our experts told us it manifests itself in ways like housing discrimination and fewer job opportunities, especially in industries that have a significant South Asian workforce, like among tech workers in Silicon Valley. South Asians represent the fastest growing group of Asian Americans and make up just over 1% of Americans overall. That's per an analysis of census data. That might sound like a small percentage, but the community can be pretty insular, which compounds the problem of caste discrimination. On top of that, this issue isn't limited to the South Asian community.
It's not just South Asians who express these kinds of prejudices, especially in densely sort of South Asian-centric industries like tech. It's not uncommon, for example, for tech workers of other ethnicities to start to imbibe these kinds of prejudices themselves, especially if they have experience working in India.
A 2018 survey by Equity Labs, a civil rights group, found 2 in 3 Dalit workers reported being treated unfairly in their U.S. workplaces. In 2020, a former Cisco employee filed a first-of-its-kind lawsuit against the company. The employee alleged his supervisors at Cisco's San Jose, California headquarters excluded him from important meetings and passed on him for promotions due to his Dalit caste. That case against the supervisors was just dismissed this week, but California is still pursuing litigation against Cisco. Because this is a religious system of hierarchy, bias often shows up in cultural practices and norms. Many South Asian communities also choose to only socialize with members of their own caste, and marriages tend to remain within caste systems too. The issue has also shown up as more South Asians immigrate to this country. Back in 2021, a group known as BAPS, a prominent Hindu sect that runs several temples across America, faced accusations of luring hundreds of lower caste laborers from India to build temples near Atlanta, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, and in Robbinsville, New Jersey. These builders reportedly worked grueling hours and made just $450 a month. And that's not even the first time this issue of caste or caste discrimination came up during the process of immigration. Back in 1923, an Indian immigrant named Bhagat Singh Thindi categorized himself as a high caste Hindu and argued his high caste status meant he should be counted as a white person and naturalized as a citizen. The Supreme Court disagreed and noted that Thindi's argument and underlying theories about high caste had been discredited by most, if not all, modern writers on the subject of ethnology. Now, the Supreme Court still had its own work to do when it comes to ethnology and social justice back then. For example, the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision, which desegregated America's schools, didn't come until the 1950s. But the fact that Thindi's case reached the highest court in the land shows how this issue of caste has been deeply prevalent in the South Asian community in America. These cases highlight how caste, social stigma around caste, and exploitation can still prevail. But the legislation trying to stop caste discrimination here in the US has received some backlash too. Groups like the Hindu American Foundation and the Coalition of Hindus of North America oppose the latest moves, arguing they are Hindu-phobic and claiming they perpetuate harmful stereotypes about the Hindu community that came about during colonial rule in India. But experts we spoke to don't support that argument. Remember, the caste system predates the colonization of India, and the Hindu-majority country itself legislates around the issue of caste.
When the Indian Constitution was put in place, nobody argued that it was Hindu-phobic or Hindu-misia. I mean, think about what you're saying here. You're saying it is not possible to be a practicing Hindu without discriminating on a caste basis? That's a bit odd.
Other groups like Hindus for Human Rights and Hindus for Caste Equity support the legislation. And of course, caste systems can be found among Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and Sikhs, other communities from South Asia too. Irrespective of its roots, caste can and has followed South Asian communities abroad, like here in the US. That's why experts we spoke to say the latest legislation and more awareness around the issue of caste and discrimination is much needed.
I think it's an important advancement in the sort of march of U.S. civil rights to explicitly recognize and then prohibit this form of discrimination, which has so far sort of gone under the radar.
Similarly, in an educational setting, we always have an eye to thinking about not just how to enforce protections, but also